Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, one of the nation's leading think tanks, to talk to Tim Walton, who's one of the research fellows here, as well as Harrison Schramm, who's a retired United States Navy commander, former helicopter pilot and statistician, also part of the team here at CSBA, and the co-authors, along with Ryan Boone, of Sustaining the Flight, Resilient Maritime Logistics for a New Era. Guys, great report, on a very, very important topic that I think folks don't focus as much on. If you look at a Pacific scenario, we just heard from General Brown, the Pacific Air Force's commander, and one of the points he made is, hey, look, I don't have an extensive road network, I don't have a rail network, so you've got to move this stuff by air and by sea. And any adversary knows that logistics are, always, right? I mean, amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Talk to us about, Tim, sort of give us an overview. What are the key takeaways from your guys' report?
Sure, Vago. Thank you very much for having us on. I think the two key takeaways are that the current and programmed maritime logistics force is inadequate to support U.S. strategy against China and Russia in particular for two primary reasons. First, the Navy's at-sea logistics force is vulnerable, and it's also increasingly lacking in the capabilities and capacity necessary to support distributed operations. And then second, in terms of the strategic sealift force, which are the government and commercial ships that transport vehicles, equipment, and supplies to forces ashore, the strategic sealift force faces major readiness challenges. It faces an imminent decline in capacity as ships rapidly age out, and then it also faces a shortage of mariners. And this hinders the Navy's and the nation's ability to project power.
Harrison, talk to us a little bit about how we got here. We were talking a little bit beforehand. There is a tendency of being like, oh my God, how could so many people be so stupid for so long? But actually, that's not the case. And you had kind of a concise way of looking at the problem, how we got here, and then how we move forward.
Thank you, Vago, and thank you for coming over and talking to us this morning. The way that we got here broadly is by optimizing the force for economy and for sustained operations in the war on terror. The people who did that did it very responsibly and very well, and they built the force that we have today. With the world changing, moving back towards great power competition, we need to think about building a force that is optimized for resiliency instead of for efficiency, which is in short saying we need to build a force that understands and is able to accept damage and casualties.
Tim, we talked to Mark Busby, who's the maritime administrator, obviously oversees the sealift force. And one of the questions for him was, what's our shortfall in sealift, right? I mean, it's not a very, very sexy topic. And if you consider that, in any adversary situation, they're going to be prime targets. These ships will be gone in the first, he said something like the first week we'll have a rather dramatic degradation in our capabilities. What's the right maritime logistics system, and I know you guys tackled this, in order to be able to generate, maintain that logistic flow that you need? An armored division consumes tens of thousands of tons of supplies alone. We're going to have to be much more distributed than we've ever been, especially in a Pacific Island campaign, and do it under fire. I mean, we just don't have enough air defense assets to protect ourselves, so you're going to be on the receiving end of DF-21s and DF-26s and a number of other different, for example, Chinese systems. Talk to us about what this maritime logistics architecture needs to look like for the future.
Sure, Vago. In terms of the strategic sealift, maritime logistics architecture, which is one of the two areas we focused on in addition to at-sea Navy logistics, in terms of strategic sealift, there are a number of challenges, as you pointed out. The Transcom commander, General Lyons, testified in March that currently in peacetime, we're only able to generate about 65% of required capacity. That situation's only getting worse as all these ships are getting retired, and we don't have enough mariners to man those in conflict. We're about 1,900 mariners short to man them in a protracted conflict. What we recommended in our study to address some of these gaps is a three-part plan that's similar to, but different from, what the Navy's proposed in their Sealift the Nation Needs. The first part is service life extension funding for a select number of government ships, and this is necessary simply to buy time for the other parts of the plan. The second part involves acquiring some foreign-built ships from the open market or from the U.S. flag, as well as some new U.S.-built ships. And in terms of the new U.S.-built ships, we considered a build profile of around 1 per year in order to provide stability for the shipbuilding base. And then the third and most important element of our plan involves the commercial merchant marine. By strengthening the commercial merchant marine, DoD and the Maritime Administration could shift away from the current flawed surge sea lift model that partly relies on buying foreign-built sea lift ships, putting them in reserve for decades with skeleton crews and not having enough crews to fully man them in a conflict, and then watching their condition and readiness atrophy, to a new model. This new model would acquire some new U.S.-built ships, but it would also strengthen the commercial merchant marine through an expanded maritime security program and additional cargo. This would provide more ships and mariners that could both support commerce in peacetime, but DoD and the commercial merchant marine could call upon them in a contingency. Another interesting element of this approach could be an increased use of contractor-owned, contractor-operated pre-positioning ships. So by having this contractor-owned approach, we would ensure that there's a sustainable level of surge shipping that's well-maintained, fully manned, and could cycle every couple of years back into commercial service. And so this would provide a more resilient fleet, and it would also be significantly less expensive than a simple recapitalization of the entire force.
But how would this, Harrison, fit into like sort of a bigger architecture, right? I mean, how do you, there's going to be intense fire, and even if we try to surge the capability, we're talking about, several dozen more, maybe several score more ships, right? I mean, at the end of the day, how does this architecture, what's the bigger way of thinking about the challenge in order to address it?
So thank you. That's a very insightful question. So far the reaction to our report when we've briefed it has been very positive because we're going around telling Navy-centric groups that the Navy should have more and better ships. The real fight.
It's amazing. It's amazing how you're pushing on an open door there.
Well, I am, but that's not the door we need to be pushing on because the punchline is that's a great idea. They should pay for it. So the real question is a budgetary one more than an operational one, and that is these ships are going to cost something, and that means in a fixed top line environment, something is going to have to be traded away. Thinking holistically about the enterprise, if you were to take to think about munitions not as just delivery from an aircraft carrier, but as a supply chain that begins from the plant in the United States all the way through, then you would have a more holistic way of thinking about how the CLF enables the fleet to do its mission. I'd like to dovetail on one of Tim's points. Building more U.S. flagged commercial shipping is a wonderful strategy because it has the unique attribute that if there is conflict, we will be very happy we did it. If there isn't conflict, we will still be very happy we did it. So we are violently in favor of that course of action.
And Tim, from a monetary standpoint, everybody, you mentioned, Harrison, this is a budget issue. About how much budget should people be wrapping their minds around? What's the investment on an annualized basis that will get us to this happy point? Because you're absolutely right? You're increasing your shipbuilding rate. The shipbuilding rate will have a trickle down on your warship side of things, right? I mean, the fewer ships you build, the ones that you build are more expensive, and you're maintaining a domestic industrial base as well and employing people. How much money should we be thinking about on an annual basis?
Sure. We assess that through what we call the national fleet approach, in which DoD cooperates more with the Maritime Administration and the commercial merchant marine. This would take about 15 years to implement in order to have a more resilient maritime logistics fleet, and it would cost about 6% more than what the U.S. government plans on spending in this area. This would be about $1.6 billion more per year, and this is an amount, I think, that's sort of reasonable and achievable. And it could come from either additional total resources, or it could come from reallocating a small portion of currently planned combatant resources to logistics ships in order to produce a more balanced fleet from what's currently a relatively imbalanced fleet where we have too many combat ships and not enough logistics ships, and so we can't get the potential of those combat ships to bear, to a more balanced one that would be more lethal and resilient. As we've done some of the analysis, we found that even relatively moderate changes, such as cutting 6 surface combatants and a couple other changes over the 30-year shipbuilding plan, would be enough to pay for this in a cost-neutral manner. So it's an approach that's likely achievable and could be pursued by the Navy.
Did you guys look at what kind of hub and spoke system and what other smaller types of ships you would need in order to distribute this load? Because not all the places that we're going, for example, have the kind of harbors that we would like to have, right? I mean, that's part of an investment strategy as well.
Yes, we did, and that way of thinking changes the way you view the entire enterprise. If you move from an economically optimal plan to one that's optimized for resilience, you realize that not only do you need more ships to deliver, you need more stockpiles of things, because the stockpile that you were initially going to rely on might not exist or might not be in a place where it's feasible to get it from the depot to where it's needed. So yes, there's definitely, and this dovetails into some work that we're doing on other topics about widely distributable forces. But yes, one of the answers is actually to have larger console ships, but one of the other answers is to have smaller ships that are able to have more freedom of maneuver and also, frankly, are more attritable.
So to build on that, in our study we focused on 5 different areas in terms of at-sea logistics for the Navy. One of those areas was refueling, and I think it sort of gives a pretty good sense of the direction we're recommending. Currently, the Navy has 15 oilers and 2 fast combat support ships in what's a relatively uniform fleet. We recommended that they shift to a more mixed fleet. This mixed fleet approach would entail the Navy going big by having these consolidated logistics tankers, which are commercial tankers that could act as intermediate refueling points for oilers. It would go small by acquiring some light oilers based off of low-cost offshore support vessel designs, and these could operate in more contested areas. It would go fast by accelerating the TAO 205 John Lewis class construction rate from around 1 per year to a sustained 2 per year. And then it would go different by acquiring some fuel bladders and barges to act as unmanned or minimally manned and attritable refueling assets in highly contested areas. What we found is that this mixed refueling architecture is not only more operationally resilient, but it's also $7 to $8 billion less expensive than an all-oiler fleet that also met peacetime and wartime demands. So it makes sense both from an operational perspective to make this shift, but also from a budgetary one.
Tim Walton and Harrison Schramm. Harrison, a retired United States Navy commander, both fellows here, research fellows here at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments. Check out Sustaining the Fight, Resilient Maritime Logistics for a New Era. You can download it from the CSBA website. Guys, thanks very much. Thanks very much for highlighting something that is actually one of the most important things, because logistics can be a deterrent. Once your adversary concludes that you have no ability to sustain yourself forward, it's not exactly, it doesn't matter how great your ships and your people are. Guys, thanks very much for highlighting this.
Thank you, Vago.
Thank you.